pawn e4, pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, pawn a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castles kingside, bishop e7, rook e1, pawn b5, bishop b3, pawn d6, pawn c3, castles kingside, pawn h3, bishop b7, pawn d4, knight a5, bishop c2, knight c4, pawn b3, knight b6, knight b1, d2, knight b6, d7, pawn b4, pawn takes d4, pawn takes d4, pawn a5, pawn takes a5, pawn c5, pawn e5, pawn takes e5, pawn takes e5, knight d5, knight e4, knight b4, bishop b1, rook takes a5, queen e2, knight b6, knight f3, g5, bishop takes e4, queen takes e4, pawn g6, queen h4, pawn h5, queen g3, knight c4, knight f3, king g7, queen f4, rook h8, pawn e6, pawn f5, bishop takes f5, queen f8, bishop e4, queen takes f4, bishop takes f4, rook e8, rook a1, d1, rook a6, rook d7, rook takes e6, knight g5, rook f6, bishop f3, rook takes f4, knight e6, king f6, knight takes f4, knight e5, rook b7, bishop d6, king f1, knight c2, rook e4, knight d4, rook b6, rook d8, knight d5, king f5, knight e3, king e6, bishop e2, king d7, bishop takes b5, knight takes b5, rook takes b5, king c6, pawn a4, bishop c7, king e2, pawn g5, pawn g3, rook a8, rook b2, rook f8, pawn f4, pawn takes f4, pawn takes f4, knight f7, rook e6, knight d6, pawn f5, rook a8, rook d2, rook takes a4, pawn f6,